Hello again, fellow primates. This is kind of a part 2, or you could say it's a companion video to my last video, which is about definitions, and also might very well be the first in a series that I plan on doing, maybe, called the GBU, or the good, the bad, and the ugly. So you might want to watch that video first. I'm sure I'll link it in the description, but you don't necessarily have to. Anyway, this is something a little different that I wanted to do. A while back, my pet human put some thought and effort into writing out a definition for what is consent. By extension, what is rape and what situations have been called rape or compared to rape that aren't rape. And the reason he ended up doing this was because he used to be a part of a podcast called Roundtable Philosophy. Now, this podcast is currently inactive and may continually be so. It may be permanently inactive, like it's done. But towards the end of this podcast's initial run, the episodes were formatted based on prepared slideshows. And the leader of the podcast would ask the other people on the podcast to come up with ideas for episodes, what they could talk about each week. And at one point, my pet human was not only actively participating in coming up with ideas for topics, but he was actually creating slideshows to use on the show. And this is one such slideshow. I've got the slides here, and I'm going to go through them one by one, and I'm going to read them, I'm going to do some elaboration on them, and then at the end of the video, I will ask you, the viewer, to give me some feedback on this. Now, right off the bat, my pet human, trying to be the comedian, made the title of this slideshow, "What is Consent? Baby Don't Rape Me No More," an obvious parody of the Haddaway classic, What is Love? Now, this may have also been inspired by previous joke titles from the podcast's creator and leader, but I still think it's a little distasteful. But it is kind of funny. So then he goes on to state his definition for what consent is, and he defines it as such. Consent is the will or permission to engage in a sex act with a specific person or persons at a particular time and place. And what he means by that is either a previously agreed upon time and place or spontaneously in kind of a here and now kind of deal. Then, he says, it can be given by initiating said sex act, requesting it verbally, or actively participating in it once the other party initiates, aka going along with it. So, seems pretty reasonable, and contrary to the yes means yes movement, or whatever the hell you call it, it can be given non-verbally. And then, he goes on to say that it cannot be given, or is not considered valid, if an individual is under the legal age of consent, under threat of violence, or physically restrained against their will, under the influence of drugs or alcohol administered to them without their knowledge, i.e. roofie or a non-alcoholic beverage surreptitiously spiked with booze, unconscious, comatose, or deceased. So that's a description of who cannot give consent. And then at the bottom he says it can be communicated verbally or through body language or through an escalating series of romantic exchanges like kissing, to fondling, to undressing, etc. You know, the kind of escalation of physical intimacy that you might see in television or movies, especially adult movies. Moving on. Stoppages and safe words. His first bullet point says, it is important to know what you are and are not comfortable doing in the bedroom. And while what you are comfortable with can be expressed non-verbally, what you are not comfortable with must be explicitly stated. The other person cannot be expected to be a mind reader, nor to interpret nonverbal signs of discomfort. Be clear about your boundaries. And I think this is good advice because feminists and social justice warriors seem to have it backwards. Basically, they say that what you are comfortable with needs to be expressed verbally, and what you're not comfortable with, you don't have to say anything and it's still rape. This kind of does the exact opposite of that. And I think it's a lot more sensible, because if you're asking permission for every single thing, it is entirely possible that that will kill the mood, and that will destroy any romance or spontaneity, any sense of adventure in the bedroom. But as long as you're clear about what you're not comfortable with, and as long as you're clear about what you don't want to do, then those boundaries, if clearly defined, will not be crossed by anyone who legitimately cares about you. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Anyway, his next bullet point says, it is also a good practice to agree upon a safe word with your partner, especially in instances of role play wherein the words stop or no may be overlooked as just a part of the game. Now, this may or may not be necessary depending on what sexual situations you're finding yourself in, but anything involving kind of rough stuff, BDSM, role play that may involve a non-consensual sort of fantasy, like basically rape role play, where you're actually having consensual sex, but your fantasy is to play it out like it's rape. In instances like that, it's very important to have a safe word and to make sure that both parties know it and can use it as soon as they're uncomfortable with something. And then the next bullet point says, when a safe word is used or a participant says stop, the other party should be given a second or two to react, but if it's loud and clearly understood, it is then their responsibility to stop the proceedings. If they continue beyond a reasonable amount of reaction time, they may be legally culpable for having committed sexual assault. Now, the purpose of him putting this in here is just to kind of acknowledge that, maybe when you're in the throes of passion, it might take you a second just to process. When someone yells stop, you go, wait, what? It might not be an immediate thing, but it shouldn't take more than a few seconds. For most people, it shouldn't take more than 2 or 3 seconds. And especially if you repeat no or stop or whatever. He wanted to throw that in there to be reasonable, just in case someone's reaction time isn't always going to be instantaneous. Just to be reasonable about it is really all he meant by that. So now we get on to the fun stuff. What is rape? So his first bullet point is that, rape is when any situation in his earlier definition of when consent cannot be given or is considered invalid. That pretty much covers what rape is. But to elaborate further, he went on to say in his next bullet point, this includes statutory rape, sex with someone under the age of consent, sex with an unconscious, comatose, or deceased person, sex with someone drugged against their will, and sex by physical force or threat of violence, and sex with someone restrained against their will, like physically restrained. And then the next bullet point says that rape is a genderless crime, which is to say that it can be committed by a member of any gender to a victim of any gender. So a rapist can be any gender identity and either biological sex, and much in the same way, a rape victim can be someone of any gender identity and either biological sex. So no matter how you try to identify yourself on Tumblr, you technically could either be a rapist or a rape victim. The potential is there. If you force a sex act on someone that doesn't want to have that sex act with you, you could be a rapist. That would make you a rapist. And unfortunately, anyone could potentially be the victim of that horrible crime. He wanted to say that because, like I said in the sort of companion piece to this video, feminists like to twist the definition of rape to make it a gendered crime, make it something that only men can do, and that women are physically incapable of doing, because they try to tie the word penetration to it. They try to make it so that you can only rape someone if you have a penis. They do not want the word envelopment associated with rape, because if you can rape someone by forced envelopment, then a woman can use her vagina to forcibly and unconsensually envelop a man's penis, and that can be rape. So that's why they kind of don't like it. But that's why this definition is as unbiased, perhaps, as one person can make it, because it does not have any gender signifiers written into it. It's written in a very gender-neutral way, and it doesn't assume that men are a majority of rapists. It doesn't assume that women are a majority of rape victims. It just spells out that if you force sex on someone in any of the above-mentioned ways, that is rape. Unfortunately, the legal definition doesn't agree necessarily, but that is one of the purposes of this video that I'll get to in a little bit. The last bullet point here on this slide says, another possible example of rape, though perhaps in more of a gray area, is sex by coercion or blackmail, wherein a person is talked into having sex for better grades or to avoid discipline for some kind of misdemeanor or lower level offense. You know, if a cop does that to somebody, or to keep some secret from going public, like blackmail. Just to name a few possibilities. So, this is the subject of some brainstorming on my pet human's part. Brainstorming which he was doing in order to try to make sure all of his bases were covered, that everything that he could possibly think of was at least mentioned, anything that was relevant. And, I mean, it makes sense to me, like it's not necessarily rape, although it does appear to be some very dubious methods of acquiring consent. So you definitely could have an argument there. And now's the part where all the feminists and social justice warriors and cultural authoritarians, I think some people are calling them now, they all are gonna get pissed off at me, because this is the part where I talk about what is not rape, according to my pet human's outline. And this first bullet point is really going to piss off Lacey Green. And it says, drunk sex is not rape, no matter what gender you are. If you choose to get yourself drunk, then you are responsible for your actions while drunk. That is why you still get charged with DUI. When you get drunk and operate a motor vehicle, thus putting other people's lives in danger through your operating said motor vehicle with impaired function, you do not get off the hook by saying, it's not my fault, I was drunk. Because in that scenario, the car did not force you to drive it. So why in the fuck are people making the argument that if you get yourself drunk and then have sex with someone, you choose to have sex with someone, you actively participated, you maybe even initiated the sex while drunk, that if you do all that, somehow that's rape? It's like that lovely little feminist poster that's been making its way around the internet, where basically they spell out a hypothetical scenario where a guy and a girl both get drunk and have sex, and they were both drunk, and they both had sex with each other, but somehow that means the girl was raped. How the fuck does that even make logical sense? Like, in that hypothetical scenario, both people experienced the same exact thing. Drunk sex. And I gotta tell you, if drunk sex counts as rape, there are a lot of fucking people walking around out there that are, by that definition, children of rape. Just some food for thought. Anyway, the next bullet point says, sex you regret is not rape. If you consented before it started happening, during, and all the way until the end, with no objections until long after the fact, you were not raped. You had consensual sex, which you later regretted. Happens to the best of us. I personally wouldn't know, being an ape, because our mating rituals are strictly for procreation, and of course driven by the evolutionary desire to procreate. But from what I understand, you humans do occasionally regret your sexual dalliances. So that bullet point makes sense to me. The next bullet point says, giving in to persistence is not rape. It is reluctantly given consent. If they did not use forceful means, and they didn't exploit any power they may have over you, i.e. professor, employer, authority figure, etc., then you just caved in to their advances. Sure, it's not the best reason to have sex with someone, but it's not rape. And that basically describes, I think, a lot of times women will eventually cave to someone who is persistently trying to pursue them sexually. Not all the time, obviously, but, they'll get tired of being asked, or they'll be tired of being hit on, and they'll just make the decision that, it's not that bad, I'll just do it and get it over with. And yeah, that isn't really a good reason to have sex with someone, but if you weren't forced, then it's still consensual. You just gave consent out of being worn down. Yeah, not the best reason to have sex with someone, but not rape either. And the last bullet point on this slide says, charity sex is not rape. If you have sex with someone you consider unattractive to make them feel better about themselves, that's more along the lines of you doing them a favor or giving them a gift than it is them taking something from you. And I don't know how often this particular scenario comes up, but I'm sure it's a thing. There are women out there who are incredibly polite and incredibly generous, and they don't even really want to say no to a guy. But if you're in one of these scenarios where you cave into persistence or you have charity sex with someone that you think is unattractive, that's not rape. And that's the point that my pet human is trying to get at here, because you have the power to say no. You have the power to keep saying no if the same person keeps trying to get consent from you. You have the power to say no until the end of time, basically. So I feel like these last two bullet points are connected. The charity sex and the reluctantly given consent to someone who's persistently pursuing you. Both not necessarily the best reasons to have sex with someone, but you do have the power to say no, so it's not actually rape. And this final slide is asking for feedback, which in the format of the initial podcast would be asked of the fellow panelists. But in this scenario, I will ask my audience these questions and perhaps add more questions that you can answer in the comments. So, obviously, in general, what do you think? The first specific question is, do you agree with my definition of consent? Do you think it's a useful one? And for the purposes of this video, we will add on to that, do you think that it should be the legal one? Or do you think it needs some improvements first? And if the latter, what do you think those improvements should be? The next bullet point is, do you think I've covered the bases of when consent cannot be given? The list of under the age of consent, under threat of violence, physically restrained, drugged against their will. Is there another one of those that my pet human didn't think of? Next one, do you think my ideas on safe words and stoppages are useful/correct? Now, this question, it would be better if someone who's experienced in things like the BDSM lifestyle and the sort of rape role play that I was talking about before, someone who's had experiences with the more, I guess, kinkier varieties of sex, if someone who's more into that lifestyle, if you will, could give some feedback and some expertise on if my pet human has covered the topic of safe words accurately. And the next one is, do you agree with my definition of rape? Is it a useful one? Why or why not? And do you think that it should be the legal definition, or does it need some improvements? And, why or why not? What improvements could be made on it, if you have any ideas? Next one, do you agree that rape is a genderless crime? Or do you think it's gendered? And if the latter, why? And, well, this would be a fun one to hear back from feminists on. I would love to hear the justification for, a feminist or a social justice warrior or whoever thinks that rape is something only a man can do. I would love to hear what the rationalization is for that, because it just boggles my mind that people can believe that. And finally, do you agree with my examples of what is not rape? If not, which one or which ones do you disagree with and why? So there you have it. You can answer all or one or none of those questions in the comments below. As always, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I always appreciate that. If you didn't, you can go ahead and give it a thumbs down and let me know why I didn't like it in the comments. And as always, subscribe for more of my videos. I'll catch you next time. Stay great, apes.